Good evening. Hi. Okay, well, we are in the book of Exodus. It seems like almost every other week we're missing something. I mean, it's Father's Day or it's Mother's Day or it's Communion night. And so we've got this evening and then Communion next Sunday night. So we'll be skipping that one too, skipping Exodus anyway. But chapter 21, pretty interesting. By the time we get to chapter 20, it is the giving of the Ten Commandments. And so what we get to in this part of the text is now an entirely different, there's a change in what we start to study where God is starting to put in all kinds of, if you will, kind of regulations, ordinances, law. And so what it does is, it sure helps you to understand. When you read what we're about to go through tonight, you'll find out that there is some part of the culture that was acceptable to the world that is so foreign to our understanding. I mean, really, really foreign. Now, there are also some places in this where you will notice that, gosh, this sounds like where we got some of our own law from. Or at least the law that's in, it was written, it's not necessarily followed, but you can see that some of the very same laws that we have in our country today, you can see where they came from. Others, you would say, boy, I sure wish we did things like this. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. We'll get all the way up to the feasts tonight, I think. And when we get to those feast chapters or those verses that talks about the feasts that God wanted to have recognized, I want to kind of save them for their own night just so that we can make sure that these are what God had put in place. But we start at chapter 21. And what I want to make sure that we understand, a couple of things before we start. The things that are mentioned here are only expected of the children of Israel. Okay, so this is for them to live by. And the reason I throw this out at the very beginning is to make sure that we all understand something. What we're going to read in some of the verses tonight are the very same verses that people who hate what we believe love to point to and say, you people believe this stuff. And the Bible condones, and we hear all that kind of stuff. What you'll end up noticing from the verses tonight, God was not instituting some brand new thing. He was taking what was already being done and said, you're not going to do, even though these things are taking place around you, you will not do them as the other people do them. And so he puts in place ways that they were to conduct themselves that was not like the pagan nations around them. And so they were to live to a different standard, though God allowed in some cases the kinds of things because they were culturally done all throughout that part of the world. But you'll notice that there is nothing in the New Testament that is to further these things. Though in the first of these sections we will talk about the biblical New Testament view of how we would be servants or indebted to God, what we would call doulos or bondservants. We'll get into that too. So chapter 21 is where we start tonight. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll go ahead and take a look at the text. Father, we thank you for gathering us this evening, and we would pray that you would give us discerning hearts and minds, and we would see the practical aspects of these elements of the law, these ordinances, things given to the judges when they would judge between the people. You have put these things in place that you would make yourself known. And so we give you thanks. We give to you all praise and honor. And we thank you that you have given us these words that we could understand how things were and have a context for them and realize that you are above all the ultimate of judges, and you are the one who does righteously. And so we thank you and we give you again honor. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, let's remember again that what we see here is because the nations around them were going to know who they were. So how they did what they did was important for the surrounding nations to watch how they conducted themselves. And so how they were to interact with one another, you'll notice that there are some pretty stringent guidelines that are put here for us. What we get is, because of history, especially the history of the world as it was 200 and 300 years ago, this is incredibly sensitive. the first section. In fact, the first really the kind of the first two sections are probably as often discussed in modern society, and it's a way of trying to marginalize the believer. Because the first part deals with slaves and masters and servants, and it's in the first 11 verses. By the time that you get to chapter 21, verse 12, it starts to get into things that would qualify for capital punishment. Now, that's debated a lot in the church today as well. How could a, quote, Christian be one who could support the death penalty or capital punishment? And here you're going to find that God gives a whole slew of reasons why it was acceptable for somebody doing a particular thing to be put to death for their crime. So this would be one of those that a crime fits, or the punishment would fit the crime. So we'll get into that as well. But chapter 21, verse 1, again, this is the governing for the guidelines, if you will, for the people under the law. So in chapter 21, verse 1, it says, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them." Now remember, by this time, Jethro has spoken with Moses and said, "So what is this that people line up and want to talk to you all the time?" And Moses had said, "Well, because I'm here to minister as God would have me be a judge." And so he says, "Well, you should be appointing people to these things in the smaller matters, and in the bigger matters, then you're able to help with the adjudication of that." Now what they're having from the Ten Commandments onward is codified. It's written down, and God has said this is how he wants it, so it won't be one thing that they're just making it up as they go, but there is now law that's being implemented. It's being written. Here's your guidelines. These are the things that you're to do. So in verse 2, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve you for 6 years, and in the 7th he will go free and pay nothing." So here is the first place where you find out that there were a class of people that we would consider as servants. Now, if you were to purchase them, the implication to this is different than the servants and the slaves that would have been done in the rest of the world. Because remember, where did these people come from? Egypt, right? They are newly released from their servitude in Egypt. There was no way that they were going free. Look at what had to be done to gain their freedom. I mean, God had to lay waste to all of Egypt in order to make that possible. And even after all of that, they got as far as the Red Sea, and as far as Pharaoh was concerned, let's go take them out. And so think of what God had to do to free them from their slavery. To think that God would somehow be okay with implementing a brand new type of slavery for these people, insane. But what you'll find is that he gives very, very clear guidelines. Now, we don't have an awful lot of detail in this that would tell us if a person would have voluntarily given themselves, but what we do know as it continues on, there is an awful lot more that is going to be said on this topic as we go through, when we get through into Leviticus and Deuteronomy in particular. So we'll find that there is a lot more detail that's given to this, and additional information that's given as we go to those. So I'm not going to try to make this a whole night just dealing with that. We'll deal with it as the text gives, but as we study through the Old Testament, we'll learn more and more about this very same topic as we go. So, if a Hebrew servant, he will serve for 6 years, and in the 7th he will go out free, and he will not pay anything for his freedom. That is not the kind of slavery that most of us think of. So for 6 years he will have been an indebted servant to that person, purchased for his contract. Now, because the topic of slavery is so toxic, and it is so historically wrought with all kinds of very raw emotions, and it should be. The kind of slavery that we think of in the last few hundred years was just heinous. It's what it was even in their times. But the idea that a person could go free at the end of that 6 years, that shows you that it's not the same kind of thing that we were talking about, and God will put very clear prohibitions on what can be done even for those servants. So at the end of that, he is able to go free. Verse 3 says, "Now if he comes in by himself, he will go out by himself. But if he comes in married, and his wife then shall go out with him." So if he comes to that servitude place for those 6 years, then he's going to, if he comes in and he's married already and he has a wife, he's going to leave with that wife. Now it tells us in verse 4, if his master has given to him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Now, this gives the impression that she would be of that same class, somebody that has been a servant to him. He's paid for that services, or those services. There may be a marital contract, but she also belongs to the person who has put her under contract or purchased. And so she'll remain, and the children born to them as well. You're going to find out that by the time we get to Deuteronomy, the same rules apply for women servants as with men. That's 6 years on, and then they are free to go at the end of that 7th year, or at the beginning of that 7th year. So then it tells us in verse 5, but if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, and I do not want to go out free, he is able to, of his own free will, then serve out the rest of his life serving that particular master. Now that means that he will be able to, exist, and part of his service is that he'll have a place to live, and he'll have all the things that he'll need, and he'll be able to function as a normal person. But he formally, of his own will, indebts himself to that master. Now, what you see is this really cool behind-the-scenes kind of a thing, and we see the New Testament understanding of this. That when you would read things like what Paul says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, a doulos. This is a person who says, I have the freedom to live my life as I want to, but I have of my own free will given myself into bondage or to service of my master, in this case, God himself, and to Jesus Christ, the one who is his representation here on earth. So Paul would be able to say, I have the freedom to do so. However, I have given myself of my own free will over to my master for a lifetime of service to him, never to return back to my own freedom. Now, that's a heavy statement, because if he's free to do it, so are we. So are we. Kind of amazing when you stop to think about it when he says it like that. Now listen to what happens in verse 5. If this guy says, I love my master, so I will indebt myself to him. I also love my wife and my kids. I have no desire for freedom independent of those. So then, notice what in verse 6. So then his master will bring him to the judges, and he shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. So that this visual of this and all of the symbolism behind it is that this man's ear would be put to a post and then run through and pierce with an awl. If you know what an awl is, that's those spike little things that you would use like when you're going to punch through leather or something. That's how you were able to, it's not like going to, what was that place where my daughter first got her ears pierced? Claire's. Where they got that little thing that just snaps us really fast and it's over with. And they put the little stud in there and it's good. Well, this one, they're stick you to the, that kind of thing. But tradition would also tell you what ends up happening from that point. There would be a ring of something, a kind of an ear ring that would be an identifier that you have indebted yourself of your own will to someone else. And so this is how it would be done in the formal sense, done in front of the judges and done to the doorpost. It would be a way of showing that you have indebted yourself. Now, verse 7, and this is where it becomes so foreign to our understanding. However, you can still see even in cultures after this, when it was the price of, if you're giving your daughter to someone, there was dowry and there was all the rest of it. So there was the payment, if you will, and so, I mean, you can see that. That's culturally, even in some places to our day, these types of things still happen. But for us, especially in our Western mind, the idea of this, you could basically say, wow, your wife is really neat and all the rest of it. What did you pay? And so, well, goats and cows and this kind of a thing. It's whatever the price would have been. Notice what it says in verse 7. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, let's be very careful with the word slave, because of, again, what it triggers in our mind is something that we remember from the history of this world. Not just this nation, but this world over the last several hundred years. But he sells his daughter to be a female slave. She shall not go out as male slaves do. And here's why. It's going to explain a little bit more, because this is done more in the marital sense. So if she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. So this gives you the understanding, this is not just a person who is going to be serving in the house, but this is a person who will be brought into the family in the marital sense. Now, if for some reason the person who has paid whatever the dowry is, and he has purchased her as, quote, this servant, this slave, but it is in the marital sense, and he does not do as he is supposed to as to a wife, then he has to do a couple of things. Make that right or let her go, no matter what he has paid. So in this case, again, not your typical slave and master as we've understood it in time, but much different back then. So, and if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. It is as though this is daughter-in-law. So she has a different status than what we would think of. Now, if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food and her clothing and her marriage rights. So now, there's two ways you can look at this. If the man who has purchased takes on another wife, or is he talking about the son to whom she has been betrothed? The language is kind of unclear, but the same would remain. If she's been brought into the family, she will be treated just like as she was the primary wife, no matter what circumstances may change. Her status does not change at all. Let me just ask this straight out. This is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Ladies, are you not glad that this has changed? Right. See, and the guys are thinking, it's probably the same here. This idea of just being, given to one wife and all of that stuff means no divided allegiances. Honestly, I'm glad that this is gone. Let me make sure I say something again. It is not as though God instituted this arrangement. This arrangement was already in place, and it was cultural to every place in the world at that time. What God says is, if this is the way that it's going to be, I am putting some very strict prohibitions on actions. And I'm making sure that what you do may just make you want to not do this in the first place. So, good, as it should be. I am grateful that this has changed, and that is one of the parts of society, as far as our understanding is, that none of this would be acceptable, or it shouldn't. But for those who would allow such a thing, God then puts in some very, very straightforward, this is what you are supposed to do. So it tells us in 11, now if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without having to pay money. She has nothing to repay. So remember, if this was the slaves like we think about it, these are rights that are not reserved for slaves as we think. These are the rights of people that are much different than what we had thought. So if this person who has, quote, purchased the services of this person does not fulfill their obligation, then the person purchased is free to go. And any of them have only a 6-year contract, and then they're up. Now, here's the funny thing, and I know that there are a lot of things that, where it falls short, but this sounds so weird to our sensibilities. But think about people who sign contracts. Think of in the professional sports world. They will sign a contract, and they'll say, for X number of years, I will serve at the pleasure of this particular team for X number of dollars, but at the end of that contract, I'm free to go somewhere else if that's what I want to do. Same kind of a principle, yet depending on who the master is and the relationship that went on, who knows? But you will notice that there are some things that are going to come up in the next couple of chapters that give some more definition to what is acceptable and what is not. Again, when we get to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, these subjects will come up again, and God will put further restrictions on what can be done. Now, in verse 12, it changes about how it is that people would be treated, and how if damage is done to a person, how you even find the institution of what we would call capital punishment. So in verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. Notice that. It's just straightforward. So you kill someone, your life is going to be required of you as well. So again, here's an interesting thing. The people will point to the first 11 verses that we've already studied, the people who don't like what we're all about, and as a way to try to dismiss anything that we believe. Oh, you're one of those Christians, so you believe everything in the Bible? Do you know that your Bible talks about slavery? Yeah, well, let's take a look at what it has to say about it, since you bring up the topic. Know how to be conversant in this. The same thing about you Christians. You're so pro-life, but you would support the death penalty? Well, let's go back to what God had to say. Does God say that he approves of, quote, slavery? No, in fact, he put so many modifications on it, it didn't even resemble what we would think of as slavery. So how about this idea that God puts a requirement on the sanctity of life? Can you imagine this if we tried to apply this to our modern way of doing things? Think about, with all of the cavalier attitude and the euphemisms that we hear about choice, imagine all the doctors who do the things that they do for pay if we were to follow this. You take a life is going to be taken. Imagine that. So he says right here, he who strikes a man so that he dies will surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then he will appoint for you a place where he may flee. This is a way of saying, look, if it wasn't some premeditated thing and they got into a fight, it's more of a what we would consider a manslaughter kind of a thing. God was going to set up places which were called cities of refuge. Or better yet, if before all that took place, if they ran into a place, here's a great example. What do we call this building? What is this? It's the sanctuary. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that people are just really criminals at heart, many places in times past would stay open 24/7. You could walk in and out of a church because you wouldn't expect that people would plunder the place. But I can tell you this, if we left this place unlocked at night, chances are within a couple of weeks nothing would be left in here. But a person would be able to come into this place, theoretically, and no matter what, the law would not be able to touch them according to this kind of thing, because what they had done was not a deliberate thing. It was something, but they wouldn't be able to leave here outside these doors. It's no longer sanctuary. But notice what God does even to that. Notice how much he continues to modify this and make sure it's like, now don't take my word and do something else with it, so let me give you further definition. However, for verse 14, but if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you will take him from my altar that he may die. That's his way of saying, I don't care if that guy goes in for sanctuary because he's claiming one thing, he's claiming manslaughter, but he deliberately, premeditatively laid in wait for that person and he killed him. Take him out of the sanctuary because he's trying to claim something that he doesn't have the right to. He did this of his own will, he thought it through, and he killed that man. Take him out of the sanctuary because he's not there for the right reasons. He's trying to play a game, so he doesn't even allow that to take place. Now, he who strikes his father or his mother will surely be put to death. Wow. Now, this puts the mothers and the fathers in the place of understanding who they were and the representation that they were supposed to be. Let's remember, again, this is to the children of Israel. If the children of Israel are doing as they're supposed to, there was an order of things, and it's now starting to be implemented. There was God who was speaking to the nation. He was going to be setting up a priesthood. They would be the representatives in the formal religious things. But in the house, if things were being done as they were supposed to, the parents would be the ones who would be leading the family in the ways of God. So they would be seen as worthy of respect. Now that assumes a great deal, does it not? But if it's being done as God would expect, then the parents would be as close as there could be to a representation in the home of the things that God would want. So the parents would be instructing the children in the ways of God. They would be these holy, sanctified, wonderful people in the home. Therefore, the children would be being led in the ways of God. And if that was taking place, then the children would never strike out against the parents. To do so would be as to strike out against God in the home setting. Now again, that assumes a whole lot of things, right? Godly parents, doing as God would ask, all of that. That's all assumed. If that's in place, kids, you don't do it. It's a death sentence. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Here's a cool thing. If there is the fear that this could potentially take place, it modifies behavior somewhat, doesn't it? See, even the idea when you talk to people about capital punishment, it's not a deterrent for a crime. Well, it's because we don't carry out the sentence. But more important than that, if there was genuinely the fear, and I guess there's a secondary part of that, if it was ever carried out like it was just spelled out so plainly here, it may very well be a deterrent. But that's secondary. Primary is that God said life for a life because God sees life as sacred. It is up to God when a person is to leave this earth. That is up to him. So if a man takes that upon himself and does that, then God's going to require it of him. It was okay for you to take a life, then it's okay for your life to be taken. One for one. Pretty heavy stuff, huh? So, verse 16. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Think about that, because we were just talking about slavery a few moments ago. If it's slavery as we have thought about it in the recent history of this world, the slave traders would be put to death for selling people into slavery. So it helps you to understand the first 11 verses are a completely different context than what we see in this world's recent history when it comes to slavery. So let's be sure that whenever we hear people talk about that, remember that verse right there, verse 16. The idea of taking a person by force and selling them to somebody else as a servant or as a slave is something that God said is a capital offense. So he's either contradicting himself, or he looks at the servants and the slavery type of a thing that we see in verse 11 or verses 1 to 11 in a very different way than what we see in verse 16. Do you see it there? That is one that people love when they hate what we're about. They will never quote that verse. They'll find the other ones. So make sure that you have this one ready when you're talking with people. So say, look, either God contradicted himself or you're reading something different in verses 1 to 11 because you want to read it differently. But let me show you in as clear, plain English as I can possibly show you. Verse 16 of chapter 21. Verse 17. He who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Wow. So, wouldn't you love to have all your kids in here? Hey guys, we're going back to the rules of the children of Israel in this house from now on. And yeah, so then what do you do once you carry out the offense in our world? Well, and again, cursing and all the rest is a much different thing than just being angry at them. There's more that's implied. So what this really goes, again, is to support the understanding of why a house would be such a place of order in the biblical sense that children acting out in this type of a way would mean a total rebellion against everything that God had already put in place. So let's make sure that we understand all of these things and take them in their broader context. Verse 18, if men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him will be acquitted, but he shall pay for that of his lost time and provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So isn't this funny? Why does God have to go to such detail? Because we always look for a way to get around the law, right? So if you've ever looked at a contract and thought, what in the world? Why is there all the fine print? It's because knuckleheads look for ways around the law. It's why we have amended our bylaws in this church. Our bylaws went from, I think, 9 pages to 38 because of a litigious society. Basically, it's like when you, if you've ever, when your kids are little, and if you've ever gone and bought them the little capes that they love to wear and all that stuff, have you ever read the labeling on those? There was one that I saw, I thought it was hilarious. There's 2 recently that I've seen. One was really old, one's very recent. The first one was a Superman cape, and it said, this cape does not give you the ability to fly. Why on earth would you have to put that there? Because somebody sued somebody for saying, you sold him a cape and my kid thought that he could fly. Here's the other one. It was in a little onesie for an infant. It says, remove child before washing. You think I'm kidding? I am dead serious. Unfortunately, somebody needs to be told this. Or is it just because of so ridiculous have we become that it's like, let's find every conceivable way to try to safeguard ourselves. I'll give you one other example. If you've seen my little grandson, He was born tiny. He was full term, but he was 5 pounds, 8 ounces. So he's a little dude. Now I look at it and say, look at his father. Look at my daughter's picture. They were little kids. They weren't huge. So he's not big according to the scales. So my daughter takes him for a checkup here just a few days ago, and he's more than doubled his weight at 4 months. Usually doubling weight is 6 months. Well, he started out small, so he's chunking up a little bit. Great. He's got little pudgy cheeks now, and he's got little rolls in his legs. Excellent. That's great. But he's still a little dude. So the doctor says, look at his arms. Look at his legs. And she throws out the word dwarfism. Brittany freaks out. What do you mean dwarfism? Are you talking about like the length, or just that they're not as big as they should be? She says, well, yeah, they're not as big as they should be. And she goes, I'm a first-time mom. Don't tell me that. Make sure you explain to me a little bit more of what you mean. He's not disproportionate. He just has not put on so much in his arms and his legs. And again, I say, look at his dad. He's got chicken legs. He's like Dad. It's genetic. I love my son-in-law, so it wasn't a slight. But I'm just saying, look at the parents. So all of that said, when my daughter came home, she was incensed. She was ready to capital punishment's got to be in here somewhere for what doctors say. So what I said to her is, look, sweetheart, you know, you're probably getting is a doctor who is going over the top, trying to make sure she doesn't get sued down the road if there's a problem. It's become that ridiculous. So with all of that said, yes, there is a point. We have all of these little, it seems like that should work fine, what we see in that one thing. However, notice then there's all the fine print that even God has to put in preemptively, because people will try to find a way to subvert and go around that particular law. So let's look at it again. Verse 18. If men contend with each other, one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, but he does not die, but he is confined to his bed. Okay, so obviously the man didn't die. What then should be done? Well, since you guys should not make it up for yourselves, let me explain what you should do in that case. Then if he rises again and he walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him will be acquitted. You don't have to put that man to death because the other guy didn't die. However, he will only pay for his loss of time, whatever it was that he was not able to do his normal function of things, and he will see to what is necessary to get him regained to where he's supposed to be. Right? So he'll pay for his rehabilitation. Chiropractors, all that kind of stuff. So, verse 20. Now, if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, then he's going to be punished. Now, notice that this isn't God saying it's okay for you to beat your people with rods. It is, don't do that, because if you do, don't think that just because they're your, quote, property, your servants, that I'm okay with it. You're going to be punished in the same way as anyone else. And your slaves will have all of the same rights as anyone else among you. So what sounds horrible, what do you mean if you let him beat his servant? The point is, if you have a servant, you're not going to treat them any different. Look at what else. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he will not be punished, for he is his property. He's his servant. You're going to notice that this is exactly the same way. If a person who has been hurt by you survives the injury, then they're not going to be put to death. This is the same thing, but recognize the point is that this is still saying, this is a person that's under contract to you. But this is the way that, again, culturally, this was the way that things were done. However, God says, you can't beat them with impunity, just like anyone else. They're going to be treated in the same manner. Now, if men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he will be surely punished according to the woman's husband, what he imposes on him. And then he will pay as the judges determine. Now, this is kind of interesting. So, if somebody does something and a woman is injured who has a child or is with child, and she gives birth prematurely, notice that he's going to be punished according to what the husband says. Well, hey, look at what happened. I think that this is what should be the case. Take him to the judges, and if they agree, then you've got to take care of that for the premature and for all the complications that come with it. But if any harm follows, then you will give life for life. Wow. So even that idea, and we still do this today. Isn't this so bizarre? In our country today, do you know that if you hit a woman in a car, if you're driving drunk, if you're texting or whatever else, or whatever you do, if it's shown to be criminal negligence, if that woman loses the baby, you can be prosecuted for that, for the life of the child. And yet, if she didn't care about it, or if she was on her way to an abortion clinic, no problem. She's free to do with what she wants, because it's, quote, her body. Isn't that so out of balance? But here, if any harm follows, then you will give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Isn't it, I think it was Gandhi who said, if you follow eye for an eye, then the whole world turns out blind. And everybody celebrated him for doing that. Ultimately, he was mocking the Bible. Was it Gandhi who said that? Somebody can help me. Was it him for sure? Well, whoever it was, let's make him innocent so nobody knows for sure. Whoever it was that said that, people would celebrate that as, oh, that's so wise, because let's be peaceful people. All right, great. You've just contradicted God in the Word. Of course, yes, this is for the children of Israel. This is not how God was dealing with the people outside of the nation. Most of the people outside of the nation wanted to kill him anyway. So, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, if a man strikes the eye of his male servant, here we're back to the idea of slaves and servants. So, let's remember again, slave owners in our recent history, and by recent I mean in the last few hundreds of years, you could do whatever you wanted to your, quote, slave. You could kill them if you wanted to, though people would ordinarily not do that because you can't get them to work for you if they're dead. So they were careful, but they treated them horrendously. There is no question, and nothing in this text would minimize the horrors of slavery. Remember what we read in verse 16? God would have had the slave owners and the ones who took them by force put to death for their crimes, and those people would be returned where they had come from. That's how God views slavery as we think of it in our recent history. Notice what happens here. If this, quote, owner of the servant or the slave hits him and it makes this man lose his eye, look at what it says. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, then he shall be let go free for the sake of his eye. Because that was a big deal. So if you've caused blindness in his eye, that man is free from you. He gets to leave you because you've done that harm to him. And even his teeth. Look at what it says in verse 27. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male servant or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. Can you imagine if they applied that rule to the NHL? I have been waiting all night for that. Seriously. I don't think there's a single guy that's played more than 10 years of hockey that has any of his teeth left. You see him in all the interviews or when they're playing on the ice. Some of those guys have really nice smiles, but you wouldn't know it. Well, I have one missing in the back here because dentists are expensive. All right. Wasn't knocked out by anybody, though. It was me. So, if he knocks out the tooth of his male or his female servant, he will let him go free for the sake of the tooth. So once again, slave owners, quote, masters, boy, they had to be careful how it was that they treated those who had indebted themselves to them. So, even in this case. Now, he gets into animals and how it is that they're to be dealt with. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox will surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox will be acquitted. So if it's just one of those things, if the animal is not shown a predisposition to this, God wants to say, look, that animal, though we don't think of them as having the same will and all the rest of it, God wants to first of all say, look, if the first time that this happens, just know that it will happen again, put the animal down. But it also helps us to understand God's view of the sanctity of life and how important life is. It's not a trivial thing as far as God is concerned. The animal, if he's done it once, will do it again, so put him down. Now, in verse 29, but if the ox tended to thrust with its horn in times past, and it has been made known to his owner, and he has kept it confined, and has not kept it confined, so that it has killed a man or a woman, the ox will be stoned, and the owner also will be put to death. Oh, wow. Can you imagine applying that whole idea to what we see with dogs and other animals? Oh, boy. Yeah. Well, In verse 30, if there is imposed on him, in verse 30, if there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he will pay it to redeem his life, whether it is imposed upon him. That's by the family of the person that's been killed. Now, if the person that's been killed says, look, you don't have to be put to death if they have compassion on him, but a sum of money is going to be paid. Well, if he can pay it, then that is a provision that's allowed. Whether it has gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment, it shall be done to him. Same thing. So if it's something that the parents say, there will be a sum of money, there's a way around it, I guess you could say, but it's up to the parents, it's up to the people. Now, if the ox gores a male or a female servant, he shall give to the master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox will be stoned. Now, this is not leading to death, remember? Because the owner's not being put to death. These are people that have been gored but not killed. But the owner of the ox, first of all, the animal's going to be put down, and then the person who owned the ox is going to have to pay for the loss of the people that were injured. Verse 33, if a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit will make it good, and he shall give money to the owner, but the dead animal shall be his. That tells you that the pit that was dug makes injury to the point where the animal has died. So, hey, look, you dug the pit, you didn't secure it, so whatever happens because of that pit, you're on the hook for it. Now, if a man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they will also divide. So it's like, okay, sorry that's happened. We didn't see it coming, so you guys can divide the proceeds of the live one and the dead one. Now, again, you have to step back from this and say, why does God have to tell these people this? Well, because they didn't seem to be able to kind of figure this stuff out for themselves, and it wasn't equitable. So God is trying to give them guidelines that would be equitable, but that also could be followed in each instance. This is the issue. So then verse 36, or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in times past, same kind of a principle up the page, but this is with other animals and not with people, but the same thing. Or it was known that the ox tended to thrust in times past, its owner has not kept it confined, he will surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal will be his own. So oxtail soup for everybody tonight. Right? So it's the same kind of thing. It is to make it where it's put in place. What we have here is the first of the recordings of codified law. So here's where God says, this is how it's going to be. I put these things in place. As we study through the rest of these books, from Exodus to Leviticus, ultimately to Deuteronomy, when you think of things of the law, and there is some of it in Numbers as well, you're going to find that what God has done is put in an entire list of things written down so that man would not be able to plead ignorance. When we look at what Paul tells us in Galatians, what the law was ultimately able to give to us was a series of laws that God had put there, and Paul would say they were perfect. But it is their perfection that is man's downfall, because man cannot possibly attain to them. Nor would he be able to plead ignorance that God didn't tell us. Oh, yes, he did. And look at the kind of detail, and we're just scratching the surface, folks. By the time that we're all done with this, the kind of detail that we're going to ultimately get through these books, yeah, you can find out that God was very, very clear about what he expected, and it will help you to also say, who on earth could ever do that? As Paul would say, that's exactly what you're supposed to come to an end of, is to say, who could possibly do that? I can't, yet God says I'm on the hook for it. What's to be done? It brings me to Jesus. All right, chapter 22, when it comes to matters of property. And a little bit of clarification. I don't think I'm going to make it to chapter 23, verse 13, where we were supposed to end tonight. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, then he will restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So now, of course, what it doesn't really tell us is, well, it gives us a little bit of a hint because of what happens in the next instance. What if that guy doesn't have 5 ox or 4 sheep, depending on what it is? We get a hint, because verse 2 says, now if the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. That means like at night. Because if he breaks up, how do we know that that's talking about at night? Because the next verse helps us with that. But if a person is breaking in and they're not known to the person to whom it is, they're breaking in, if there's violence done and that person dies during the commission of his crime, then the person who puts him to death is not going to be guilty of his bloodshed. It's done at night. There's no reasoning. You don't know. You don't understand the intention. There is a little bit of a caveat given to us in verse 3. But if the sun is risen on him, there will be guilt for his bloodshed. He shall make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. That is their explanation. Well, if the guy steals ox or sheep, then he's going to have to return it 5 for the ox or 4 for the sheep. Well, what if he can't pay that? Then he's going to be one of those 6-year servants. So there you go. Make you think twice about stealing a sheep or an ox, wouldn't it? So you would think. Well, what we get is the difference between the two. Now, if it happens at night and the guy's breaking in, and in your trying to prevent him from doing what he's doing, you kill him, you're not responsible for his bloodshed. He's the guy who perpetrated the crime. If you do it in daylight when everything can be seen, then you make sure that you take that guy, have him apprehended, and he's going to have to pay restitution. He's going to become your servant for 6 years. So now this may help you to understand why guys might get beat as servants. Oh yeah, you're that guy that tried to heist a few of my sheep. Let me beat you. Well, make sure you don't lose an eye or a tooth, because you're going to lose them altogether. You get the point? You see how all of this starts to, form the basis of the law? And I got to tell you, I'm glad that we don't necessarily have things quite like this any longer. But it does help you to understand that God is not slack about things of law. I do believe that rule of law is enormously important across the board, so long as those laws do not violate a higher law, and that's what God says is acceptable. Right? So if ever a time came when the government said, you must do this, and you look at the scripture and says, where God says, no, you must do this, and those two are in conflict, go to jail. So, I don't really need to elaborate much on that. I suppose that the day could come, because it happens elsewhere in the world, where a person like me is told you can't teach what's in the Bible. If a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed and lets loose his animal and feeds it in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. How do you like that? That's great, because that just lets you know, it's like, man, I got everything in my field is really, really good and well kept. Why don't I let him go graze in that other guy's field? It's all junky. Well, if you do that, you're gonna have that guy come back and say, I want some of your grapes, man, because your goat ate mine. Well, yours is a messed up yard. That's why I let my guy go over there. Yeah, but you didn't see him eat it, and I'm going to tell you my stuff was good, so give me yours. You see? Kind of makes everybody, this is kind of the way, this is what homeowners associations do. They make everybody have a nice house. Well, okay, I don't want to take too much license with this. You get the picture? If you turn your goats loose, or your sheep or your ox or whatever else, if you turn them loose over there, just know if they're caught eating that stuff, you're going to have to pay for it. If fire breaks out and it catches in thorns, so that stacked grain or standing grain or a field is concerned, he who kindled the fire will have to make restitution. We do that still, If they can ever figure out who starts the forest fires. Oh, and if people get injured in that, oh yeah, you'll spend a lot of time in prison. Verse 8. Now, if the thief is, verse 7. If a man delivers to his neighbors money or articles to be kept, because he's unable to secure them himself, so he gives them over to a person who is more able to secure them. So you're basically your storage companies. So if he delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, and it is stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, then that thief will pay double, twice as much as what he stole. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house will be brought to the judges to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. So the person that it was left, if they can't figure it out, they're going to make sure that the guy didn't just say, well, yeah, somebody broke in, I don't know. This is the essence of insurance fraud. This is the kind of stuff that people do all the time. I was talking with somebody recently, and he had just said when the riots broke out in the early 90s, there was a company that this person that I know worked for, he's probably been listening to me right now, and the people that he worked for took a whole bunch of their inventory and shoved it in a back room and claimed that they were broken into. They made a fraudulent claim. Wow. This is the kind of stuff that they would find out. Man, if the judges found out, that guy's in big trouble. For any kind of trespass, whether it concerns an ox or a donkey or a sheep or clothing or any kind of lost clothing which another claims to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges, and whoever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. So let them adjudicate things. When there's just not clear evidence, let them hear the case. If a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep, and it dies, is hurt, or is driven away, and no one seeing it, then an oath of the Lord shall be between them both, that he has not put his hand into the neighbor's goods, and the owner of it will accept that, and he will make good on it. If there was no one to see this, there's really no way to adjudicate it. It has to be one of those things that you have to believe the word of the person. Now, verse 12, if in fact it is stolen from him, he will make restitution to the owner of it. Now, if it is torn in pieces by a beast, then he shall bring it as evidence, and he shall not have to make good on what was torn. Look, it's not a negligent thing. If there's a whole herd of animals and some predator gets in, what are you going to do? It's just one of those things. If it was negligence, we've already seen that there are ways to deal with that. This is one of those freaks of nature. If you kind of show them, look, this thing's been torn limb from limb. I couldn't have done anything about it. It happened while we were sleeping. It was not negligence. It just happened. So he'd be absolved from that. Verse 14. And if a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it becomes injured or dies, the owner of it will not being with it, he shall surely make it good. Now, does this also apply to lawnmowers and all the rest of it? Same kind of a principle. They just didn't have those back then. I know you might be surprised to know that, but your lawnmowers were basically your livestock. So they were the ones that kept the grass trimmed. But you get the point here. Anybody that borrows anything else, if it gets damaged, you have to make good on that. You borrowed it. It was in your custody. Now notice in verse 15, if its owner was with it, he will not make it good. If he was hired, it comes for its hire. So look, if you brought your animal or anything else and it was injured in the process, you were hired to do a job. It's your property. And if it was damaged under your watch, don't go after the guy that had hired you for the job. Boy, don't you wish we would employ that across the board. Wouldn't that be nice? Well, boy, now you get into some other stuff. And again, this is why it's really great that we have children's ministry. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Now this is, we're told in Deuteronomy, we'll get there eventually in chapter 22, that was 50 pieces of silver, shekels, 50 shekels of silver. So if this guy sees this woman and entices her, he's the guy that's responsible, and he's going to pay to the parents what would be the normal price for a bride. And so in verse 15, if her father utterly refuses to give her to him, then he shall pay the money according to the bride price of virgins. That means not necessarily if the guy, you're still going to pay up, but I'm not giving you my daughter. So, verse 18, you will not permit a sorcerer to live. Wow. Now again, this is a matter of within the children of Israel. So it's not law. Ultimately, God will certainly see to this when he's the judge of all things. But among the people, notice what he does. This is because God is going to be sure that worship is holy at all times. A sorcerer. Think of all the things that sorcerers would do. And those, obviously, those will also be in part of the law as it goes further. But this really is pretty broad. This is any of the dark arts kind of things. And so, here's what's really funny. There are things that technically would fall under this definition even practiced in the church today. Did you know that? All of the weird meditative practices that are very much of the East and trying to alter the states of the person, just because it's called prayer and meditation by some, doesn't change the fact that you are altering your states, which God says never do so. That is a type of sorcery. Interesting. Well, we'll get into more of that as time goes by, because he will give definition on sorcery. Verse 19, whoever lies with an animal will be put to death. Really, we need to hear about that? Does that even need to be said? Here's an interesting thing, because this is not a thing, quote unquote, in our society. What is becoming a very big thing, and I still have the freedom somewhat to say this, although I think the day would come with what I'm about to say could get me in a lot of trouble with the government. One thing that is definitely a big issue in our society right now is homosexuality. Some people would say, and they point this, maybe you've heard this argument given, well, Jesus never addressed homosexuality. Have you ever heard that said? How many of you ever said that or heard that said? He never comes out and straight up says homosexuals. He never uses it. So I've heard people use that as a way of excusing homosexuality. Since Jesus didn't address it, he must be okay with it. Here's something Jesus never talked about either. What I just read? Lying with an animal? So using that logic, I guess that Jesus must have been okay with bestiality. Let's think it all the way through. I'm serious when I say all of this. Because if that's going to be the argument, let's go ahead and look at all of the other prohibitions that are in the law that Jesus never addressed. That doesn't mean that he's okay with them. He just didn't have to address them because it wasn't a thing. Nor would he have to support a law that's already in place because he wasn't here to remove those things. So if he doesn't address it, so what? That's not an issue. He wasn't dealing with it. So here's one of those places to say, and it's very simple because it's not dealt with right here, but also one of the other prohibitions that we'll get to as we go through these in these chapters, necrophilia. That's gross to even say it, but yeah, that was a thing that God said, I absolutely forbid, which means it must have been being done somewhere in the world. And how disgusting is that? Well, Jesus never addressed it. You get the point? You guys are like really uncomfortable with this, right? I'm uncomfortable with it. All right. It's very gross. So, verse 20. He who sacrifices to any god except to the Lord, he will be utterly destroyed. Wow. That's among the children of Israel, yes. But notice that it is not just one of those things. You're going to get a slap on the hand and you're going to be put in detention. Or you'll have to have some time out. You shall not neither mistreat the stranger nor oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That's the first time that he employs that reasoning. The way that you deal with the stranger in your midst, do not treat them like you were treated when you were in Egypt. Remember where you've come from. Live by a different standard. How cool is that? Notice what he says also. That you will not afflict any widow or fatherless child. This idea of afflicting means to humiliate or to mistreat. Now, notice what this is being said of here. You're not to do this. Remember let's make a New Testament observation of this from James chapter 1. Let me think I wrote it down. Verse 27, where James says, now pure and undefiled religion is to visit the widow and the orphan. That idea of ministering to those very same people that here God says, you never mistreat or humiliate those people. They are the defenseless. And notice it's God who says, if you're going to do that to the defenseless, just know that I'm their defender. How cool is that? Pick it up with what James says. You want to see what is pure and undefiled when it comes to your, quote, service to God? Minister to the orphans and widows, and then we'll find out that you're serious. How cool, huh? If you afflict them, here's where he is their defense. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will be widows, and your children fatherless. Do you notice how much he puts into that? He doesn't say what he is going to do in a personal sense. Remember, everything else, if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you at the hands of the judges or anybody else. But when it comes to widows and fatherless children, he's the avenger. I'm going to hear, and I'm going to hear their cry, and my anger will be made hot. And here's what's coming. How amazing is that? That God is the one who, the first time that he speaks about he being their defense. Awesome, huh? Verse 25, if you lend money to one another of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like the money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. Wow. Isn't that a interesting thing? Pun not intended. If you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you will return it to him before the sun goes down. This is kind of that idea of pawn. You have nothing whatsoever, but you need something, and so what are you going to give as a pledge? Well, I don't have anything, but I have my coat. Okay, great. Look at what that is. Even if you're going to give it your coat as your assurance, notice, if you take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you will return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. Now, you're going to notice an interesting thing here, and unfortunately we won't be able to get to it tonight. But when we do again, we get to chapter 30, and we get a little bit of it at the end of this chapter. There is the idea that we want to be careful of the poor, but we don't want to be disproportionate one way or the other in how we mistreat them or how we give them preferential treatment. We're supposed to be blind to such things. So let's go on. And I will spend some real time with that in 2 weeks, because nowadays in the church, we hear, how many of you have heard the term, quote, social justice? When you hear it being mentioned in the church, there is an issue with that. And we will be able to look at this and say, how does God view that? So, look at this, verse 28. You will not revile God, nor will you curse a ruler of your people. You won't see them as despicable. Now, that's because you've got the problem. Now, if they do despicable things, remember, God is the one who ultimately has a problem with them, and he calls them out. We're studying that on Sunday mornings as we look through the prophets. Those are the people that are being spoken of, the rulers and the people that God has put in place. You don't speak against them, but God sometimes will. When they are no longer representing him, then that's a different story altogether. But if you're able to say that these people are doing as God wants, you don't despise or you don't call either of them out. Now, you shall not delay, verse 29, to offer the first of your ripe produce and of your juices, your firstborn of your sons, you will give to me. Likewise, you will do with your oxen and your sheep, and it shall be with its mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you will give it to me. This is the first fruits, and we'll get into that a lot more. It's discussed in the next chapter. But that idea that the first of everything, the best and the first of everything, was always to be given or dedicated to the Lord, and you will not do that. So verse 31, and you shall be holy men to me, and you shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Once again, why? Because it's been killed in a different way. It has not been drained of its blood. It is not kosher. So you throw it to the dogs. So chapter 23, we won't have time for it tonight, though it is incredibly interesting, because it starts to go into how people deal one with another, and about the poor and all the rest of it. Very, very important stuff that we recognize. So I'm over by a few minutes. My apologies. I think I let you guys out of here early last week, right? So, you're on my time. So I gave you guys, I'm kidding with you. So let's stand, and we'll have a closing word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word once again. And we do see, as we study through this history, we realize that so much of what we see here is not necessarily the laws that we live under, though some of them are similar. But we also want to recognize from this that you expect of your people a different way of living than what we see in the world. And so we would ask, Lord, that as we come to you and as we study these things, that we would make the practical application of what we read here and recognize that you are indeed holy and perfect and pure. And so you ask of your people that we should be the same. We ask, Lord, that as we see these things and recognize that level of holiness, that we would be challenged to be likewise. So we give you thanks and we give you praise for your word and pray that we would grow by it. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.